Blizzard said that they're going to return a lot of old pruned abilities back to the game. And in this video, we're going to go over 10 abilities that people might want to see return the most. And at number 10, we have Sentry Totem. This is an old shaman ability which didn't have any DPS benefits and only had the effect to allow you to look through the eyes of the totem itself. Now, this totem was removed for pretty obvious reasons. It's not very useful, but it was a fun ability that could be used to take screenshots of your character, or to situationally allow you to spy on people with the totem, like in battlegrounds or in some PvP situations. It's definitely not needed. You're not really missing anything by not having it on your class. It's kind of the definition of ability that's totally fine to prune from the game. And that's kind of why it was removed when they got rid of a lot of the totems people weren't using very much. However, they're returning a whole bunch of abilities like this to the game, so this definitely seems like one that people might want to see return. And currently it's not in the Shadowlands beta, so it looks like it's going to stay gone for a bit. And at number 9, we have Volley. This is an AoE ability that hunters used to have, which was just their version of Blizzard basically, where they got to channel an AoE at a location. This was removed from the game when they just converted multi-shot into their AoE ability, as it was kind of weird for hunters to have a channeled ability like this in the first place, considering they're a ranged physical DPS class. But this didn't stop players from wanting it back, so it was returned as a talent, which basically just allowed your abilities to sometimes proc an AoE, which isn't really the same. Currently in Shadowlands, this ability is making a return in its old form. It will appear as a final talent option for marksman hunters, and works a lot like Rain of Fire than it does the original channel form, where you choose an AoE location and just set it and forget it, as it will launch a whole bunch of arrows over the duration for 6 seconds, which is the closest hunters have had to the ability returning to the game since it was removed in Cataclysm, if you ignore the passive-like effects that have been given as a talent over the years. Although, if we want to talk about an ability that was completely gone from the game, we could also mention Eyes of the Beast here. Another hunter ability which didn't have much combat use and basically just allowed you to control your pet for around a minute, at the cost of losing control of your character in the process. It was kind of like Sentry Totem that was only situationally useful, although it had more situations in which it was useful than even Sentry Totem, which is why they kind of made it a priority to return it to the game and not Sentry Totem, as it is currently planned to be added to Shadowlands, even if it's not really working on the beta. They did talk in an interview once that they literally just lost the code for Eyes of the Beast when they removed it, and since they had to recreate that code for Classic WoW, there was no reason for them not to add it back to the live version of the game. And at number 8, we have Alter Time. This was a major ability back when it was added to the game during Mists of Pandaria, and basically what it did was send you back in time around 5 to 10 seconds, setting you back to whatever you were standing and whichever buffs were currently active on you at the time. Now, this wasn't super useful. It did have some niche uses where it also resets your health, so if you were able to time it correctly, you could just heal up all the damage you took, which is something that's basically accomplished by Temporal Shield that mages have today, as a PvP talent. Although, another one of the advantage Alter Time had was the fact that it lets you keep your buffs and go back to your previous position. So you could jump off of a cliff and then just go back as long as you didn't die, and assuming you didn't go too far away, because there is a soft limit on how far you go before it just wouldn't work, and it could allow you to extend the duration of Bloodlust on you for about another 10 seconds, which was generally how it was used in order to get a DPS bonus. All in all, it was kind of tedious to keep the bonuses with Alter Time, so it wasn't a very well liked ability on the whole, and people complained about it all the time when it was first added, because this was in the time when Blizzard still added new abilities to classes with every new expansion. Before, they just gave us a new borrowed power system every expansion instead, so they weren't happy that their new ability for this expansion was just Alter Time, while other classes were getting much more useful abilities. So eventually in Legion it was just removed since it wasn't super useful, even if it did have minor DPS benefits. And of course, after the ability was removed, everybody started remembering how much they actually really loved it, and were clamoring for its return in some way, shape, or form. So in the Shadowlands, they're adding Alter Time back to mages as a baseline ability, except it will be losing its DPS benefit that it used to have, as it only returns you back to your location with your health, no mana, no buffs or debuffs, but it does allow you to go back earlier in case you don't want to have to wait the full 10 seconds by just clicking the button again. And at number 7, we have Mind Soothe. This is another one of those niche abilities that was removed because it's not super useful. You kind of start seeing a theme and pattern around these things, where all it did was allow you to cast debuff on humanoid targets only in order to lower their detection radius, which could allow you to sneak past them easier. And since this buff did not put you in combat, you could cast on a whole group of humanoid mobs in order to allow you to skip a trash pack, which would actually be super useful in Mythic Plus dungeons, as this ability was removed from the game right before those were added to the game, as Mind Soothe was with Priest when it first launched in Vanilla WoW, but were removed after Mists of Pandaria for being kind of useless. But in the Shadowlands, they will be making a return, and will probably still be very niche in its use. But you can bet if there is a Mythic Plus dungeon with lots of humanoid mobs, Priest will now have a way to maybe skip one pack with a little bit of setup. Which I guess still isn't super useful. There was a reason this ability was removed. People just kind of like to have niche abilities for these incredibly niche situations that make people feel useful. And giving them little dumb abilities like Mind Soothe that let them be useful every now and then can only be a good thing. And at number 6, we have Burst of Speed. This was a talent rogues had which allowed them to basically use half their energy bar in order to give them a mini sprint for around 4 seconds. Now, it didn't have much combat uses in raids and dungeons. It was only useful outside of combat, as you had to give up a lot of your energy in order to use it in addition to a global cooldown. But for me, personally, my favorite use of this ability was just using it to run old raids, as it allowed you to speed through them really quickly. And currently, with all of the nerfs to old raid running, if they added this ability back to the game, rogues would be the fastest old raid runners. The main problem with the ability was in PvP. The amount of mobility this talent gave rogues basically meant they could never be slowed, and could always catch up to you, which was a little bit strong, since the ability historically also removed slows when it was used, as that was just one of its passive bonus effects. So if they were to return this ability to the game, it'd be fine if they just removed that feature of Burst of Speed, so I could use it to run old dungeons again, as currently Burst of Speed is not on the Shadowlands beta. And since it was never a baseline class ability and a talent that rogues could take, it's not really a high priority for them to add back either, especially since the mobility of classes has just been going down over the recent years, and it was only allowed to exist back in the day because every class was super mobile back then. It would be a little bit broken today, and they'd have to make a whole bunch of nerfs to it in order to make it really work. And at number 5, we have Shattering Throw. This was an ability added to the game with the Wrath of the Lich King, and gave warriors the ability to actually dispel a Paladin's Bubble or a Mage's Ice Block, two invulnerabilities that are normally not dispellable, except by a Priest Mass Dispel as well. This was basically one of 2 ways to get rid of those 2 immunity abilities. It also basically allowed you to destroy normal bubbles that players had on themselves, as it did a ridiculous amount of extra damage if they had an absorption shield. Basically, this ability was used to get rid of things your opponent was using to protect themselves. Although mages and paladins weren't really keen on 2 classes being able to remove their biggest defensive cooldown, so the ability was removed with warriors and legions, even though a lot of warriors actually really liked the ability, and it was incredibly useful in PvP, even if it did have a long cooldown and a cast time. Although I'm sure this was more of a class balance thing for PvP, more than it was an ability pruning like most of the other ones on this list. Besides maybe Burst of Speed as well, which was probably removed for similar reasons. However, this ability will be making a return in Shadowlands, functioning almost exactly how it used to work. It has a cast time, long cooldown, breaks immunities, and deals a whole bunch of extra damage to absorption shields. And at number 4, we have Symbiosis. Symbiosis is probably one of the most complicated abilities that was ever added to the game, and was a balancing nightmare for Blizzard, which is definitely why it was removed from the game after only 1 expansion, as it was given to druids in Mists of Pandaria, and then removed before Warlords of Draenor. This is one of those new abilities that was given to druids in the expansion, which was super impactful, whereas they only gave mages something like Altered Time, which should show you a little bit why mages didn't like the ability at first, since they were comparing it to something like Symbiosis. So, what did Symbiosis do? Well, it had the ability to grant druids one of 40 abilities, as it would give the druid a new ability depending on which spec the druid was in, and which class they used the ability on. So, if a druid was imbalanced and used it on a Death Knight, they would gain the ability to use Anti-Magic Shell. If they were Resto Druid and used it on a Death Knight, they'd gain the ability to use Icebound Fortitude, and etc, etc. Basically, it allowed them to copy one ability from another class, but they didn't get to choose what it was. It was preordained. And the other class they used it on would also gain an ability, although they would always gain the same ability depending on which spec they were in. So if using it on that same Death Knight, if they were in Blood spec, they would gain the Might of Ursoc ability, or if they were in Frost or Unholy, they would gain the ability to use Wild Mushroom's Plague. Another ability which I'm not sure is actually in the game anymore, but used to be something that druids could use. Now, there were a couple of other broken interactions with this. Priests would gain the Cyclone ability, which was completely bonkers in PvP, and Resto druids could gain the ability to use Ice Block, Aspect of the Turtle, or use Spirit Walker's Grace to cast while moving. It allowed a whole bunch of class combinations that really shouldn't have existed, and it just definitely made it too hard to balance, as if they wanted to change one ability from a class, they would also have to change its Symbiosis version. So, rather than trying to balance 40 different druid-specific abilities and 30 abilities they could grant to other classes, they just removed it in order to get rid of a headache for themselves. And you'll be surprised to know that this is not returning in the Shadowlands. However, one of the Druid Covenant abilities, specifically the Kyrian Covenant, they have an ability called Kindred Spirits, which functions very similarly to Symbiosis, where it allows you to form a bond with an ally, and then you grant them an effect based on your role, and then they grant you an effect as well. So using it on another DPS player, you'll basically give each other a DPS increase, or an increase to healing if you're a healer, etc, etc. So Symbiosis without granting abilities. So it's kind of making a return in a way. And at number 3, we have Divine Intervention. This was a spell that was in the game for Paladins from Vanilla WoW all the way to Wrath of the Lich King. And what it did was allow the Paladin to kill themselves in order to place an unbreakable bubble on another party member, which removed them from combat. The ability essentially allowed you to save a healer during a wipe so they could start resurrecting people and get to another attempt faster. But since the ability had a 1-hour cooldown, it wasn't a very reliable method to have faster attempts, and also wasn't the most useful ability in the world either. The ability, though, did have a couple of benefits. One of them was it could also save you repair bill during the one time you used it, and the other was the ability to sometimes completely break fights. You see, the weird way this ability worked made it bug out a lot of certain fights if used on a specific raid member during a specific mechanic, like Razorgore the Untamed, for example. It infamously would bug the fight out because of a whole bunch of mind control mechanics not really working super well when put under stress. And Blizzard even admitted that they would have to design fights around Divine Intervention, potentially breaking it. And they were very glad when it was removed so they could not have to worry about that one ability completely nullifying certain mechanics anymore. It was kind of an all or nothing thing, where it was either a completely almost useless ability that had a nice flavor of sometimes allowing you to save a repair bell and get to another attempt faster after a wipe, or it would completely break a fight and allow you to win in a way that was not intended. The ability made a short return in Legion as a passive ability for Ret Paladins, where it would act as a cheat death ability that would activate the Divine Shield spell automatically when brought to death, and also passively reduce the cooldown of that ability. And it was kind of strong, so they eventually removed the talent after Legion, and that was the last we saw of Divine Intervention. It existed for the early portion of the days of Vanilla to Wrath, removed in Cataclysm, added back for one expansion in Legion as a talent, and then removed again in BFA. Currently, there are no plans for it to return in the Shadowlands, although with how much better Blizzard is at potentially fixing bosses so they can't be broken with this ability, and their effort to return a whole bunch of other flavor abilities, it seems like it would be the perfect time for them to return it in its original form. And at number 2, we have Corpse Explosion. This was a glyph that Death Knights had, which would teach them an ability called Corpse Explosion, which allowed them to use a rune in order to blow up a nearby corpse in order to deal AoE damage in quite a large radius, as it would hit everything within 20 yards. And since this did not have a cooldown and actually did some decent AoE damage if you blew up enough corpses, it was a fun alternative way to deal AoE damage in a dungeon or raid. Although a glyph, which could pull decent damage, was considered a little bit too strong by Blizzard. So they gave it a 5-second cooldown and made it cost 40 runic power instead of a rune. But there was this hidden little interaction with Corpse Explosion where you could use it on your ghoul in order to blow it up for a significant amount of damage, which kind of turned it into a legitimate AoE cooldown. Although they removed this portion as well, and they just kept nerfing the ability over time before eventually they just removed it, because it was supposed to be a fun little extra ability that wasn't supposed to be a serious method of AoE. It did make a return as a cosmetic ability called Corpse Exploder, which basically allowed you to blow up a random corpse nearby for no damage and just a cosmetic effect on a long cooldown for no reason. But in the Shadowlands, they've added a new ability to the game called Sacrificial Pact, which on a 2-minute cooldown allows you to blow up your summoned ghoul for a significant amount of AoE damage, and heal the Death Knight for 25% of their maximum health. Now, this new ability is actually a reference to 2 old Death Knight abilities, Corpse Explosion and the old functionality of Death Pact, as Death Pact used to be a baseline ability for Death Knights that allowed you to sacrifice your ghoul to heal you for 40% of your health. So it was a pretty significant heal. Nowadays, it still heals you and is an unholy talent, but you don't need to kill your pet in order to use it. So the new Sacrificial Pact has the abilities of the old Corpse Explosion and the Death Pact in one, and is an excellent homage to those 2 old Death Knight abilities. So while Corpse Explosion isn't returning in name, it's definitely returning in spirit. At least a part of it anyway. And at number 1, we have Ritual of Doom. This is an ability that Warlocks used to have, which would allow them to perform a ritual with 4 other party members, where they would summon a Doom Guard at the cost of one of their lives. And then the Warlock would have to tame this Doom Guard if they wanted to use it with their Enslaved Demon feature. This ability was removed from the game in Cataclysm and simply converted into the ability called Summon Doom Guard, which just allows you to summon a Doom Guard without having to go to the effort of performing a ritual that kills one of your party members. But here's the thing with the Doom Guard. The ability was removed in Battle for Azeroth, and currently the only way to summon a Doom Guard is through a talent which only has a very low chance to summon it. But in the Shadowlands, they added the ritual back in its original vanilla form even. It was a very late addition to the beta, so who knows if it will stay in the game once Shadowlands actually goes live. Alright, and that's the list. I did try to include at least one ability from each class, except the Monk and Demon Hunter since they're the 2 newer ones. But if you know of any other abilities that you'd like to see return in Shadowlands, I'd love to hear about them down in the comments, so maybe make a future video on the same topic. And also, fun fact, did you know only 34.8% of people who watch these videos are actually subscribed to the channel?